On a chilly autumn morning in Lexington, Virginia, a poised and dignified black woman named Judge Eleanor Matthews stepped through the grand entrance of the federal courthouse ready to begin her workday. Her silver hair framed her calm face as she carried a leather briefcase and adjusted her navy coat against the crisp breeze. But what should have been a routine arrival quickly turned into a humiliating ordeal. Deputy Carl Jenkins, a courthouse security officer with nearly 2 decades of service, locked eyes on Eleanor with suspicion the moment she approached the metal detectors. Ignoring the federal judge badge she calmly presented, Jenkins abruptly ordered her out of line. Without explanation, he escorted her down a quiet corridor to a small, windowless room. There, to the shock of anyone who might have witnessed it, he forced Eleanor into a chair and began shaving her hair off, a cruel act meant to strip her of her dignity. Throughout the ordeal, Eleanor remained composed, her heart racing but her voice steady as she protested the injustice. Jenkins sneered, mocking her, believing his actions would break her spirit. What he did not understand was that Eleanor's silence was not surrender. It was the gathering of strength. This moment of degradation set the stage for a powerful reckoning, one that would reveal a deeper struggle against prejudice and abuse within the justice system, a fight Eleanor was determined to lead with unwavering courage. Judge Eleanor Matthews was no ordinary woman. Calm, steady, and dignified, she carried the weight of her authority lightly, not as a badge of privilege but as a responsibility to the people she served. Yet on that chilly morning in Lexington, Virginia, the very authority she embodied was challenged in the most humiliating way. When Deputy Carl Jenkins seized her federal judiciary badge without a word and ignored it entirely, it was not just a personal insult, but a symbol of the deeper prejudices still lingering in places of power. Eleanor understood the gravity of the moment. She could have reacted with anger, demanded respect, or shouted at the injustice unfolding before her eyes. But she chose something far more powerful: silence. Her calm was not weakness. It was a deliberate act of resilience. The deputy's cold gaze measured her as if she were a problem to be solved, not a person worthy of dignity. His refusal to acknowledge her position and his decision to forcibly shave her hair were meant to strip away not just her appearance, but her very identity. Her hair was more than curls. It was history, pride, and a symbol of strength that generations before her had worn with dignity. Each lock that fell to the cold floor was an attempt to erase that legacy. Yet Eleanor sat quietly in that small, stark room, refusing to give him the satisfaction of witnessing her broken spirit. Her fists clenched, but her breathing remained steady. In the quiet, she was gathering the calm before the storm. Deputy Jenkins, on the other hand, misjudged the moment entirely. His act of cruelty was fueled by bias and a misplaced sense of control. But he failed to see that beneath the surface of Eleanor's quiet endurance lay a formidable power, one that would soon turn the tables. In his mind, he believed that this act would make her know her place. Instead, it only strengthened her resolve to seek justice not just for herself, but for all those who had been silenced or mistreated. This was not the first time Jenkins had crossed the line. Unbeknownst to Eleanor, multiple complaints had been filed against him over the years. 12 official reports of harassment and abuse, all buried and ignored by the very system charged with upholding justice. It was a painful reminder that prejudice was not only an individual problem, but a systemic one. Eleanor carried this knowledge with quiet determination as she prepared to step back into the courtroom. When she emerged from the room, her head partially shaved, Eleanor did not hide or shrink away. Instead, she walked with a deliberate strength, each step echoing through the courthouse halls like a call to action. Her exposed scalp was a visible testament to the cruelty she had endured, but it was also a symbol of unyielding courage. Without hesitation, she donned her judge's robe, the garment that symbolized justice and authority, and took her seat on the bench. The room fell silent as everyone took in the scene, a black woman humiliated and exposed yet unbowed, commanding the highest seat in the courthouse. Deputy Jenkins, standing at the back, was frozen. His face paled as he realized the gravity of his mistake. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically. The woman he had tried to demean now held all the authority. Her silence had transformed into an unshakable presence that demanded respect and accountability. For Eleanor Matthews, this was only the beginning. The forced shaving of her hair was a cruel attempt to diminish her, but it ignited a fire that would fuel her fight against systemic injustice. Her calm and composed response sent a powerful message: dignity cannot be taken by force. It is something that resides in the heart and mind. This moment of quiet strength marked the start of a journey to expose the deep-seated biases within the justice system and to bring about meaningful change. The courage Eleanor displayed that morning resonated far beyond the courthouse walls. It reminded all who witnessed it that true power lies not in intimidation or cruelty, but in the unwavering commitment to truth and justice. Her story would inspire many, especially those who had felt powerless or voiceless, to stand firm in the face of injustice. After enduring the humiliating ordeal of having her hair forcibly shaved off by Deputy Carl Jenkins, Judge Eleanor Matthews did something many would not expect. She returned to the courthouse unbowed and resolute. Her head still tingled from the cold clipper blades, the uneven patches of her hair standing as silent reminders of the cruelty she had just faced. Yet her composure remained unbroken. Without hesitation, she walked through the grand courtroom doors and took her rightful place on the bench, the seat of authority and justice that she had earned through years of dedication and service. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Lawyers, witnesses, and onlookers alike stared in disbelief at the woman who had been dragged away and humiliated just moments before. Eleanor's presence radiated quiet strength, a powerful contrast to the chaos that had briefly engulfed the courthouse. She did not rush or seek sympathy. Instead, she moved with deliberate grace, her steps echoing softly on the polished marble floor. Draping her judge's robe over her shoulders, Eleanor seemed to transform not into a symbol of mere legal power, but into a beacon of resilience and dignity. Deputy Jenkins stood at the back of the courtroom, frozen like a man caught in his own wrongdoing. The confident sneer that had once marked his face was gone, replaced by a pale, speechless expression. When their eyes met, it was clear that Eleanor held the upper hand, not through aggression, but through the undeniable authority of truth and justice. His attempt to diminish her had backfired spectacularly. As the trial proceeded, Eleanor presided with the steady hand that had earned her respect over the years. The courtroom became the stage where long-suppressed grievances would finally be heard. Witnesses came forward recounting stories of abuse, discrimination, and civil rights violations committed by law enforcement officers, including Jenkins himself. Among them was Joseph Banner, a retired Army veteran who described being violently shoved to the pavement by a police officer during a protest. Another witness, a young woman, testified about being pushed into a patrol car for simply recording the police. Throughout the proceedings, Eleanor remained composed, listening intently and taking careful notes. Her calm demeanor was not a sign of detachment, but of focused determination. She knew that this trial was about far more than the actions of one man. It was about exposing a system that had allowed such abuses to continue unchecked for years. When it was time to confront Deputy Jenkins directly, Eleanor's questions were precise and unyielding. She revealed that he had a troubling history, 12 prior complaints of misconduct, all dismissed without consequence. The weight of this revelation was heavy in the room. Jenkins, now visibly shaken, could no longer hide behind his badge or his silence. The courtroom witnessed a reckoning that had been long overdue. In a powerful moment, Eleanor announced Jenkins's immediate suspension and the filing of formal charges against him. The deputy was led away in handcuffs, stripped of his authority and forced to face accountability. There was no applause, only a solemn acknowledgement that justice at long last was being served. But Eleanor's actions went beyond this singular case. She unveiled a comprehensive reform plan designed to prevent future abuses within the courthouse and the wider judicial district. The Matthews reform included mandatory bias training for all courthouse personnel, psychological evaluations, anonymous channels for reporting misconduct, and a strict zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. Her message was clear: the justice system must no longer tolerate silence or complicity in the face of injustice. This was not a quest for revenge, but a solemn responsibility to uphold fairness and equality for all citizens. The courtroom, once a place where fear and prejudice had too often reigned, began to feel different, charged with hope and a new sense of purpose. Eleanor Matthews' courage became a rallying point, inspiring the community and sparking broader conversations about civil rights and systemic change. By standing firm and reclaiming her seat, Eleanor sent a message that resonated far beyond the walls of that courthouse: dignity and justice cannot be stripped away by force, and those who wield power must be held accountable. Her quiet strength became a powerful force for change, reminding all who witnessed her journey that true justice requires courage, persistence, and unwavering integrity. Judge Eleanor Matthews sat calmly behind the bench, presiding over a case that would become a pivotal moment in her career and in the fight against systemic injustice. The courtroom in Lexington, Virginia was filled with tension as witnesses recounted stories of police misconduct and civil rights violations, shedding light on a troubling pattern of abuse that had long been ignored. Among the first to testify was Joseph Banner, a retired Army veteran with a limp and a wrist brace. He described the night of a peaceful protest where he stood holding a sign that read "Justice for All." Banner recounted how Officer Darren Voss shoved him violently to the pavement, cracking his ribs. When he pleaded for help, he was met with disbelief and accusations of faking his injury. Judge Matthews listened with steady attention, her eyes never leaving the witness as he spoke, her demeanor a balance of empathy and judicial resolve. Next came a young woman who told how she had been pushed face first into a patrol car simply for recording the police during the same protest. Her testimony was clear, her voice unwavering as she described the fear and violation she experienced. The courtroom remained silent but for the sound of her words and the occasional scribble of notes. At the defense table sat Deputy Carl Jenkins, the very man who had humiliated Judge Matthews by forcibly shaving her hair in a courthouse hallway just days before. His confident exterior was beginning to crack. As the testimonies unfolded, his hands twitched nervously and his eyes darted around the room. Judge Matthews maintained a calm and composed presence throughout, but those paying close attention noticed subtle signs of her inner resolve. She had faced humiliation and injustice firsthand, yet her voice remained steady and clear as she carried out her duties. When it was time to address Deputy Jenkins, Judge Matthews questioned him directly. She reminded him of his 18 years on the courthouse security force and asked pointedly how many women he had physically handled without cause. Jenkins stammered, struggling to answer. The courtroom was silent, waiting. Judge Matthews then revealed a startling truth. Jenkins had been the subject of 12 official complaints over the years, all ignored or dismissed by supervisors unwilling to hold him accountable. This revelation sent a ripple through the courtroom. The man who had tried to humiliate the judge now faced the consequences of a career built on unchecked misconduct. With unwavering authority, Judge Matthews ordered Jenkins suspended immediately and announced that formal charges were being filed against him with the Department of Justice. The deputy would no longer wear his badge or patrol the halls. Instead, he would answer for his actions in a court of law. But the judge's work did not end there. Recognizing the need for systemic change, she unveiled a comprehensive reform plan she called the Matthews Reform. This initiative mandated regular bias training for all courthouse personnel, psychological screenings to ensure suitability for duty, anonymous channels for reporting misconduct, and a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination or abuse. Judge Matthews's words resonated deeply with everyone present. She made it clear that this was not about revenge, but about responsibility, a duty to uphold truth and fairness, even when it was uncomfortable. Her reform was a call to action, a blueprint for a judiciary that served all citizens equally and without prejudice. As the courtroom adjourned, there was a palpable shift in the atmosphere. What had once been a place shadowed by fear and injustice now held a sense of hope and possibility. Judge Matthews's courage and leadership inspired those present and sent a message far beyond Lexington's courthouse walls. Her story, marked by resilience and determination, became a symbol of progress. It reminded everyone that true justice requires not only the rule of law, but also the courage to confront and dismantle the biases and abuses lurking within the system. In reclaiming her role and leading the charge for reform, Judge Eleanor Matthews demonstrated that even in the face of personal humiliation and systemic failure, steadfast commitment to justice can ignite lasting change. The courtroom in Lexington, Virginia had long been a place where the silence of injustice hung heavily in the air. But that day, under the steady gaze of Judge Eleanor Matthews, that silence began to shatter. As testimony unfolded, it became clear that the mistreatment and abuse carried out by Deputy Carl Jenkins were not isolated incidents, but part of a disturbing pattern that had gone unchecked for years. Judge Matthews listened carefully as witnesses bravely recounted their experiences. Among them was Joseph Banner, a retired Army veteran who described being violently shoved to the ground during a peaceful protest. The pain of cracked ribs and the indignity of being dismissed as a faker spoke volumes about the deep wounds inflicted by those sworn to protect. Another witness shared how she was pushed face first into a patrol car simply for exercising her right to record officers in public. These stories were not just testimony, they were the voices of a community long ignored. Yet perhaps the most revealing moment came when Judge Matthews confronted Deputy Jenkins directly. Over his 18 years as a courthouse security officer, Jenkins had amassed 12 official complaints, 12 voices raised against him that had been buried and dismissed by those who lacked the will or authority to act. This revelation exposed a troubling culture of silence and complicity within the very institution tasked with upholding justice. Jenkins, once confident and unyielding, faltered under the weight of these accusations. His hands trembled and his voice cracked as he faced the consequences he had long evaded. Judge Matthews' steady, commanding presence reminded everyone in the room that no one was above the law, especially those who abused their power. Immediately, Jenkins was suspended and charged with civil rights violations and abuse of authority. The courtroom watched in solemn silence as he was led away in handcuffs, stripped of his badge, no longer shielded by the system that had once protected him. But Judge Matthews knew that true justice required more than punishment. She unveiled a comprehensive reform plan, later known as the Matthews Reform, aimed at dismantling the systemic issues that allowed such abuses to persist. This plan mandated bias training for all courthouse employees, psychological screenings to ensure fitness for duty, confidential channels for reporting misconduct, and a strict zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. Her message was clear and unwavering. The courthouse must no longer be a place where power hides behind procedure or silence. It must be a place of accountability, fairness, and respect for all citizens. The courtroom atmosphere shifted profoundly. What had once been a place clouded by fear and resignation now felt charged with hope and determination. Judge Matthews' courage inspired not only those present, but also the wider community, sparking conversations about civil rights and systemic reform across Lexington and beyond. Her actions signaled a turning point. By exposing long-buried complaints and holding a powerful figure accountable, Judge Matthews brought light to the dark corners of the justice system. She showed that resilience, integrity, and leadership could break through barriers of prejudice and silence. In standing firm, Eleanor Matthews reminded everyone that justice is not merely a set of rules or a title, but a living commitment to truth and equality. Her fight was not just personal, it was a call to society to confront uncomfortable truths and demand better. As Jenkins faced the legal consequences of his actions, the community watched with a renewed sense of possibility. The courthouse, once a symbol of oppression for many, began its transformation into a beacon of hope and fairness. Judge Eleanor Matthews' story is one of courage in the face of cruelty, resilience amid systemic failure, and the relentless pursuit of justice. It serves as a powerful reminder that change begins with those willing to speak out, stand tall, and lead by example. Judge Eleanor Matthews did not stop at simply holding Deputy Carl Jenkins accountable for his cruel and unjust actions. She knew that the deeper problem lay within the very system that had allowed such misconduct to continue unchecked for so long. With the strength of her voice and the clarity of her purpose, she introduced what would become a transformative set of reforms designed to ensure that no person would ever suffer the humiliation and injustice she had endured. The Matthews Reform was comprehensive and bold. At its core, it mandated mandatory bias training for all courthouse personnel, from security officers to clerks to bailiffs. Judge Matthews believed that awareness was the first step toward change. The training was designed not just to educate, but to challenge long-held prejudices and assumptions, fostering empathy and respect for every individual who entered the courthouse doors. Recognizing that personal accountability went beyond attitudes, the reform also introduced psychological screenings for all employees. This measure was aimed at ensuring that those entrusted with power and authority were mentally fit to carry out their duties with fairness and integrity. It was a safeguard against the abuse of power rooted in unchecked biases or unresolved personal issues. One of the most crucial components of the reform was the establishment of anonymous reporting channels. For too long, victims and witnesses of misconduct had been silenced by fear of retaliation or disbelief. Now these confidential pathways would empower them to speak out safely and have their concerns addressed seriously and promptly. Judge Matthews was adamant that silence was no longer an option. Furthermore, the reform included annual public oversight evaluations and an unprecedented level of transparency for the courthouse. These evaluations would ensure ongoing accountability and demonstrate to the public that justice was not only administered fairly but also openly monitored. This step aimed to rebuild trust between the judiciary and the community it served. Perhaps most importantly, the Matthews Reform set a strict zero-tolerance policy for any discriminatory conduct by employees or officials under the courthouse's jurisdiction. This policy was a clear statement that prejudice and abuse would not be tolerated in any form, and violations would result in swift and decisive consequences. Judge Matthews presented the reform plan with calm authority, making it clear that this was not about revenge for her personal suffering, but about responsibility to the truth and to every citizen seeking justice. Her words resonated deeply in the courtroom, signaling a new era where fairness and accountability would be the pillars of the judicial system. The impact of the reform extended beyond the courthouse walls. Media coverage brought national attention to the case and the proposed changes. Civil rights groups rallied in support, recognizing the importance of such reforms in combating systemic injustice. Politicians and community leaders began engaging in meaningful dialogue about how to implement similar measures elsewhere. Within the courthouse, the atmosphere shifted noticeably. Employees who had once felt emboldened to ignore or dismiss complaints now found themselves under scrutiny. Victims and witnesses felt a renewed sense of hope that their voices would be heard and their rights protected. The courthouse was becoming a place where justice was not just an ideal, but an actively pursued reality. Judge Matthews's unwavering commitment inspired many, especially older citizens who had long witnessed injustices quietly endured. Her leadership reminded them that change is possible even in institutions that seem resistant to it. Her courage gave voice to those who had been silenced and showed that one person's determination could spark a movement toward justice. The journey was far from over, but the Matthews reform marked a pivotal step forward. It challenged complacency, confronted prejudice, and demanded accountability. More than anything, it reaffirmed the essential truth that justice belongs to every citizen, and the systems designed to uphold it must reflect that fundamental principle. In standing firm and enacting these reforms, Judge Eleanor Matthews set an example of resilience, integrity, and hope. Her story serves as a beacon for all who believe in the power of justice to heal, transform, and unite communities. The story of Judge Eleanor Matthews and Deputy Carl Jenkins quickly spread beyond the walls of the Lexington courthouse, capturing the attention of the nation. What had begun as a deeply personal and painful encounter transformed into a powerful catalyst for change that resonated far beyond the courtroom. Media outlets from major networks like CNN and MSNBC picked up the story, sharing the shocking footage of Jenkins forcibly shaving a judge's hair and the subsequent trial that exposed years of unchecked misconduct. National civil rights organizations rallied behind Judge Matthews, recognizing the significance of the case not only as a matter of individual justice, but as a glaring example of systemic racial bias within law enforcement and the judiciary. Demonstrations and peaceful gatherings took place on courthouse steps across the country, where citizens of all ages, grandparents, veterans, students, and community leaders stood united in calling for accountability and reform. The political response was swift and serious. Senators and representatives began to take notice, holding hearings and demanding answers from judicial oversight bodies and law enforcement agencies. The Department of Justice opened an official investigation into the Lexington courthouse's practices, particularly focusing on the long history of complaints against Deputy Jenkins that had been ignored or suppressed. Within Lexington itself, the atmosphere was charged with a new energy. The courthouse, once seen as a symbol of silence and oppression for many in the community, began to feel like a place of possibility and progress. Residents gathered not only to witness the trial, but also to participate in conversations about racial justice, police accountability, and systemic reform. Judge Matthews herself became a figure of inspiration, particularly among older generations who had lived through decades of civil rights struggles. Her courage in standing up to injustice reminded many that the fight for equality was ongoing, and that their voices and experiences still mattered. She received countless messages of support, from letters and phone calls to visits from community members who had once felt powerless. Amid this groundswell of support, grassroots organizations mobilized to build coalitions dedicated to sustained change. They organized workshops on citizens' rights, hosted forums on bias and discrimination, and worked with local officials to implement the Matthews reform policies throughout the district and beyond. The ripple effect extended to training programs for law enforcement officers who were now required to undergo bias awareness and de-escalation training. Psychological evaluations and anonymous reporting mechanisms were put in place to ensure that misconduct would not be swept under the rug again. Perhaps most significantly, the story sparked a national conversation about the role of silence and complicity in allowing systemic abuses to persist. Community members, activists, and leaders across the country began to recognize that ignoring wrongdoing was itself a form of violence, a sentiment reflected in the growing demand for transparency and accountability in all institutions of power. In Lexington's courthouse, the atmosphere had changed irreversibly. No longer was it a place where injustices could be hidden behind procedure or ignored by indifference. Instead, it had become a symbol of hope, a place where justice could be reclaimed by the people it was meant to serve. Judge Matthews continued to lead by example, showing that resilience and steadfast commitment to justice could inspire not only legal reform but also cultural transformation. Her story served as a reminder to all Americans, especially older generations who had witnessed much struggle, that their continued engagement was vital to creating a more just and equitable society. As news of the reforms spread and the courthouse reopened with renewed purpose, the city of Lexington began to heal and grow. The streets that once echoed with silence now resonated with the voices of a community united in demanding dignity and fairness for all. In the end, what started as a moment of personal humiliation for Judge Matthews became a powerful movement for justice that touched countless lives. Her courage, supported by a community unwilling to remain silent, sparked change that would reverberate across the nation for years to come. The courtroom had always been a symbol of authority and order, but for many in the community, it had also been a place where power was wielded behind closed doors, often without accountability. That all changed the day Judge Eleanor Matthews reclaimed her seat on the bench after the shocking humiliation she endured at the hands of Deputy Carl Jenkins. Her presence that day was more than a return. It was a declaration that justice would no longer be a silent ritual, but a transparent and inclusive process. Judge Matthews' demeanor was calm yet commanding as she addressed the courtroom. She held up a manila folder clearly labeled Matthews Reform and announced the immediate enactment of new policies within the courthouse and recommendations for the wider judicial district. These policies included mandatory bias training for all courthouse staff, psychological evaluations to ensure fairness, confidential channels for reporting misconduct, and a zero-tolerance stance on discriminatory behavior. The room was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. This was not about revenge for personal injury, she explained, but about collective responsibility and the pursuit of true justice. The reform was designed to protect every citizen who walked through the courthouse doors, ensuring their dignity and rights would be respected. For the first time, the courthouse felt like a place where change was not just promised but enacted. The defense attorneys who had once dismissed concerns about bias now sat quietly absorbing the implications of a system held to a higher standard. The staff and spectators alike sensed that the atmosphere had shifted, a new era had begun. Judge Matthews went on to acknowledge the difficult work ahead. Reform would not be easy, and it would require vigilance and courage from everyone involved. But she was resolute, vowing to carry the cause forward to the district council, the circuit court, and even the state senate if necessary. Her message was clear: what happened to her must never happen to anyone else. The impact of her actions reached far beyond the courtroom. Local media covered the story extensively, and civil rights groups lauded the reforms as a critical step toward dismantling systemic injustice. Citizens who had long felt marginalized and voiceless found hope in the leadership Judge Matthews displayed. In the days and weeks that followed, the courthouse became a hub of activity and reflection. Training sessions were scheduled, anonymous reporting systems put into place, and oversight committees formed to monitor the progress of the reforms. Conversations about bias and equity became part of the courthouse culture, no longer topics to be avoided but necessary discussions for growth. Outside the courthouse, community members gathered to support the movement. Grandparents who had witnessed decades of struggle, veterans who understood sacrifice, and young people eager for a fairer future all joined together. Their solidarity created a powerful chorus demanding accountability and justice. Judge Matthews' leadership demonstrated that the face of justice could be both compassionate and firm. She embodied the principle that true authority comes not from power wielded in silence, but from transparency, accountability, and unwavering commitment to fairness. Her story resonated especially with older Americans who had experienced the long, difficult journey toward civil rights and equality. It reminded them that progress is never final, and that their voices remain essential in shaping a just society. The courthouse, once a fortress of silence and exclusion, was now becoming a mirror reflecting the community's hopes and values. Judge Matthews had redrawn its boundaries not with bricks and mortar but with principles that included everyone. As the city of Lexington moved forward, the lessons of that day continued to inspire. The quiet strength of one woman had sparked a movement, turning personal pain into collective purpose. It was a reminder to all that justice is not just about laws, but about people, and that true justice belongs to everyone. On the courthouse steps of Lexington, Virginia, a quiet but powerful scene unfolded. Judge Eleanor Matthews stood tall, her head still tender from the humiliating act of having her hair forcibly shaved by Deputy Carl Jenkins just days before. Yet she walked out with unwavering dignity and a renewed purpose. Her courage had ignited a change that went far beyond her own experience. The city felt different, the air charged with hope and the possibility of justice that finally included everyone. Eleanor's story became a beacon of resilience and strength, reminding us all that justice is not just a word or a rule written on paper. It is a living, breathing commitment to fairness, accountability, and respect. The courthouse, once a place shadowed by silence and fear, transformed into a symbol of transparency and reform. People of all ages gathered, standing quietly but firmly, demanding a system that truly served every citizen equally. This powerful moment teaches us that no matter how deep the wounds or how daunting the obstacles, standing up for what is right can inspire a ripple effect that changes communities and lives. It reminds us that dignity cannot be taken away unless we allow it, and that true justice requires courage, resilience, and an unwavering voice. Life lesson. In life, we may face moments where we feel powerless or unheard. But like Judge Matthews, we each hold within us a strength that can turn adversity into action. When we stand firm in our truth and fight for fairness, we don't just change our story, we help transform the world around us. Your voice matters. Your courage matters. Never underestimate the power of standing tall even when the world tries to bring you down. If this story moved you, please share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to join us in sharing more inspiring stories of resilience and hope. Together we can make a difference, one voice at a time.